My son, Michael, left me for dead in the Alaskan wilderness, without a single bite of food or a piece of equipment. He had hoped I would either starve or be torn apart by a bear, clearing the way for him to claim my inheritance. But when he got back to the house, I was already there, a smile plastered on my face, and I told him I had a surprise for him. Before all that, our story begins. The front door of my house suddenly burst open without a knock. Michael stormed inside, his hoodie still damp from the constant Seattle drizzle, his sneakers squeaking on the polished hardwood floors. He immediately demanded $5,000 from me. I froze at my desk, still holding a pen from reviewing invoices. The aggressive tone in his voice hit me with a physical force. This wasn't my son pleading for assistance. This was someone issuing an order. I just asked him what he was talking about, and he repeated that he needed the money tonight. He began to pace the length of the living room, his hands clenched tightly into fists. I told him I had already sent his monthly allowance just last week, and that the $3,000 was hardly enough to cover his rent. His voice cracked with frustration as he asked if I thought that was enough, if I believed it covered everything. The flannel shirt I was wearing suddenly felt too constricting. I could still feel the grease under my fingernails from working on Mrs. Chen's transmission earlier that day. I had built my auto shops from nothing, working 18-hour days after my late wife, Susan, passed away. I had sacrificed everything to give him a life I never had myself. I tried to remind him that we had discussed this before and that he needed to find a steady job. He spun around, his face flushed with anger, and scoffed at the idea of work. He asked me why he should have to work when I was sitting on so much money, claiming I controlled everything like a dictator. The accusation stung. I instinctively straightened my shoulders, my old military posture kicking in, and explained that I was simply trying to teach him about responsibility. He laughed bitterly at my words. He then told me that after I died, he would be an incredible master of the auto shops and that he would run them better than I ever had. His words hung in the air between us like a dose of poison. My chest tightened. He had spoken so casually about my death, and there was a cold calculation in his eyes. I realized this wasn't frustration or grief speaking. It was pure greed. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came out. 20 years of being a single parent, of sacrificing, of hoping he would become a man his mother, Susan, would have been proud of. All of it crumbled in that single moment. Michael must have seen the shock on my face, and his expression shifted as he realized he had gone too far and said too much. Without another word, he spun around and headed for the door. The sound of it slamming shut echoed through the house like a gunshot. A family photo on the mantel rattled, and Susan's smiling face seemed to tremble behind the glass. I stood there, frozen, and watched as it slowly settled back into its place. The silence that followed was heavy and pressed in on me. Outside, Michael's car engine roared to life and the sound slowly faded away into the distance. I remained frozen by my desk, the pen still gripped in my white-knuckled hand, staring at the photo that seemed to still be trembling. The next morning, I reached up and carefully straightened the family photo on the mantel. Susan's face was smiling back at me. She looked so young and radiant, holding our 8-year-old son, Michael, at one of his Little League games. The memory of that day hit me like a physical blow. I remembered Susan's funeral, with Michael standing beside me in a suit that was 3 sizes too big, clutching my hand as I struggled to stay standing. The mortgage on my first auto shop was 3 months past due, and Susan's medical bills had completely drained our savings. I had promised her on her deathbed that I would take care of him and give him everything she was unable to. By Thursday, I found myself pulling out old photo albums and looking through them. Each page I turned revealed another sacrifice I had forgotten I had made. There was the $40,000 a year I'd spent on Michael's private school tuition because the public schools weren't good enough for Susan's son. There was his University of Washington education, complete with the dorm experience he had insisted on. There was the $18,000 I'd paid in cash for the Honda Civic I bought him for graduation, because he had refused to drive a used car. I traced the edges of a picture from his 16th birthday. Even then, I could see that something was missing in his eyes. While other kids his age were working summer jobs, Michael spent his time gaming, living off the monthly allowances that I had justified as an investment in his future. The progression was now perfectly clear to me, spread across decades of photographs. Every handout, every failure I had rescued him from, every crisis I had solved with my checkbook had carved away at his character. I had thought I was being a good father. Instead, I had created a stranger who saw my death as nothing more than a business transaction. That Saturday evening, I sat in Susan's old chair, the one I had never had the heart to get rid of. She would have seen this coming. Susan had always understood people better than I did. She would have pushed him toward independence, making him earn every single dollar he received. I failed her. I whispered to the empty room. The realization settled into my bones like a winter chill. I had spent 20 years trying to buy Michael's love, trying to make up for the mother he had lost. Every payment I had made had just been a bandage over my own feelings of guilt and inadequacy. I had convinced myself that simply providing for him was the same as actually parenting him. The next Sunday morning, I put the albums back on their shelf and sat down at my desk. My hands were shaking slightly as I reached for a pen and a blank sheet of paper. My military training kicked in, and I steadied my breathing. I knew I had to think clearly now and plan for possibilities I had never wanted to consider. The blank page simply stared back at me, waiting for me to make decisions I wasn't ready to make. My pen hovered over the legal documents I had been drafting when the quiet was shattered by the ringing of my phone. Michael's name glowed on the screen. I hesitated for a moment, then answered the call. I heard his voice on the other end, carrying an artificial cheerfulness that set my teeth on edge. It was too bright and too eager, like a salesman's opening pitch. I told him I was fine and that his call was unexpected after our conversation the previous week. He said he had been thinking, and that he was way out of line and wanted to make things right between us. His words came too fast, sounding too practiced to be genuine. He said he had a proposal for me, something that could fix everything between us. I waited patiently, my military training teaching me the value of silence. He suggested that we go camping together in Alaska, to Denali National Park, just the two of us, like we did when he was a kid. The suggestion hit me like whiplash. Michael hadn't shown any interest in outdoor activities since high school. I pointed out that his suggestion was very sudden. He said he knew it was sudden, but that his friends had canceled on him at the last minute and the tickets were going to go to waste. He said that everything was already paid for. Flights, camping gear, park permits, and that the entire package would expire the next day if we didn't use it. My grip on the phone tightened. The urgency in his voice felt manufactured, as if it was designed to keep me from thinking too carefully about what he was saying. I asked him when he had ever organized a camping trip before. He said, "Come on, Dad," and reminded me of when I had taught him how to read animal tracks and how to start a fire with wet wood. He told me that I had always said the wilderness shows a man's true character. The reference to our shared past twisted something painful in my chest. Those had been good times before my wife, Susan's, death had changed everything, before I had started trying to solve our problems with money instead of just being there for him. He continued, his voice dropping to a more sincere tone, saying that this could be our chance to reconnect. He said we could remember what we used to have, with no distractions, no stress from the city, just a father and his son in the wilderness. I closed my eyes, feeling a battle between hope and instinct rage inside my chest. Every rational part of my brain was screaming a warning at me. The sudden timing, his sudden enthusiasm, the convenient story about his friends canceling. It all felt orchestrated. But underneath all of my suspicion was a deeper pain. What if this was actually real? What if my son genuinely wanted to rebuild our relationship? Michael pressed on, telling me the flights were scheduled for March 25th, going from Seattle to Anchorage. He said we would then drive to the park for 5 days in the wilderness, just like we used to. I slowly repeated his words. 5 days. He pleaded with me, saying the tickets were burning a hole in his pocket and that this might be our last chance to fix what was broken between us. The silence between us stretched on. I looked down at the papers on my desk. They were legal documents that could change everything, precautions against possibilities I had prayed would never come to pass. I heard myself say, "All right, let's do it." He sounded so excited when he asked if I was serious. He said he would text me the flight details and that we would meet at the SeaTac departure gate. He told me it was going to be an amazing trip and that I would see. Then the line went dead. I set the phone down on the desk carefully, my hand trembling slightly. Outside, the eternal Seattle drizzle was painting patterns on the window. I looked back at the documents spread across my desk, and then at the pen I was still holding. Hope and preparation, both of those things felt like a betrayal. 3 days later, I folded the legal documents carefully and slipped them into a hidden pocket in my travel bag. The papers felt much heavier than they should have, weighed down with the possibilities I had never wanted to consider. Michael was waiting by gate C12, bouncing on his heels like an overeager teenager. His backpack looked brand new. The tags were still attached to the zippers. When he saw me approaching, he gave me a grin that seemed a little too wide. He told me my timing was perfect because they had just called for boarding. I told him he seemed excited, and as I studied his face, I noticed a slight twitch in his left eye. My military training had taught me how to read nervous energy, allowing me to distinguish genuine enthusiasm from a performance. He asked me why he wouldn't be excited about a father-son adventure in the last frontier, and then shouldered his pack with obvious effort. He then asked me when the last time we had done something like this was. During our first flight, he chatted nonstop about wilderness photography and fresh air. He kept checking his phone more often than seemed necessary for someone who was supposedly eager to disconnect. I told him stories from my time in Navy survival training. I told him about how to read weather patterns, how to identify edible plants, and how to navigate without a GPS. Michael asked me if I really knew all of that stuff, and he was scribbling notes on a napkin. I told him that 20 years in the service teaches you to be prepared for anything. A flicker of something crossed his expression. It was a flash of calculation disguised as admiration. Our layover in Seattle lasted longer than we had expected. Michael excused himself to use the bathroom 3 times, and each time he was gone for over 20 minutes. Through the terminal windows, I watched as planes taxied against the gray afternoon sky, knowing that Alaska was getting closer with each passing hour. Our final flight took us over mountain ranges that looked like broken teeth against the horizon. Michael pressed his face to the window, but the tension in his reflection was more noticeable than any sense of wonder. Anchorage hit us with a blast of crisp air and the scent of snow. The rental car counter moved efficiently, and soon we had a Toyota 4Runner with extra insurance and chains for the mountain roads. I handled the paperwork while Michael loaded our gear, favoring his right shoulder as if it ached. He announced that we needed to go to an outdoor supply store next, consulting his phone again. He said we needed to get a few extra things. At Northern Exposure Outfitters, he was insistent on specific items: high-powered flashlights, emergency flares, and rope, which seemed like more than we would need for a basic camping trip. The clerk, a weathered man with frostbitten scars on his face, raised an eyebrow at our purchases and asked if we were planning on getting lost out there. Michael replied quickly that we just wanted to be prepared. Highway 3 stretched out before us like a gray ribbon cutting through an endless forest. Mountains rose on both sides, and their snow-capped peaks caught the last of the daylight. Road signs along the way warned us about moose crossings and winter driving conditions. I tried to break the silence that had settled between us by saying what beautiful country it was. Michael's voice held a strange satisfaction as he agreed and pointed out how isolated it was, saying we were miles from anywhere. We stopped for gas as darkness began to fall. While I filled the tank, Michael wandered toward the convenience store. Through the store's fluorescent-lit windows, I watched as he pulled out his phone and made a call. His posture had changed. His shoulders were hunched over, and his voice was low and urgent. When he returned, I casually asked if everything was all right because I had seen him on the phone. He avoided eye contact as he told me he was just checking the weather conditions for the next day, saying a storm system was moving in but should clear by morning. The lie came too easily from him. I had checked the forecast myself, and clear skies were predicted for the next 3 days. As we pulled back onto the highway, that familiar military unease began to settle in my gut. It was the same instinct that had kept me alive in hostile territory. Something was wrong. I just couldn't put my finger on what it was. 40 miles later, the conversation from the gas station was still bothering me. I decided to ask him again what the weather service had actually said. Michael's grip on the door handle tightened. He told me the forecast was for possible snow flurries, but nothing major. His deflection confirmed my suspicions, but I kept my voice neutral as I simply said it was a good thing we had packed extra layers. Denali's entrance appeared as we rounded a bend, marked by wooden signs announcing the park boundaries and cabins scattered among towering spruce trees. The visitor center was buzzing with early morning activity, which was unusual for the season. Most tourists come in the summer, and March visitors are typically serious outdoorsmen or locals. The Denali Lodge Motel looked exactly like the photos Michael had shown me in the brochure. It had a rustic log construction, with rooms that had names like Grizzly Den and Caribou Creek. The young desk clerk had calloused hands and processed our registration while Michael studied the trail maps on the wall. She asked if this was our first time in Denali. I nodded toward Michael and said that it was his first time, but that I had been to Alaska before for military exercises. She asked which trails we were considering. Michael stepped forward before I had a chance to answer and told her we wanted to do the Tlanica River backcountry route, saying we wanted the full wilderness experience. The clerk's face immediately showed concern, and she told us that it was advanced and very remote terrain, saying that most people start with shorter nature trails. Michael insisted that we were experienced campers, even though his definition of experience had included exactly 0 actual camping trips in the last 10 years. Park Ranger Jennifer Walsh looked like she had stepped right out of a recruitment poster. She was confident and capable, with the no-nonsense bearing of someone who dealt with every type of wilderness emergency. Her briefing room smelled of coffee and pine, with topographical maps and wildlife photos covering the walls. She spread a detailed map across the conference table and told us to be clear about what we were undertaking. She said the Tlanica River route would take us 30 miles from the nearest ranger station and that there would be no cell coverage or other campers at this time of year. She pointed to several red markers scattered across the map, telling us there had been recent grizzly activity in those areas. She also said 2 cubs had been spotted just the week before, which meant a protective mother was nearby. She also warned us about recent wolf pack sightings and said that moose are unpredictable during spring territory disputes. Michael leaned forward, studying the most isolated sections of the map with intense focus. He asked her about emergency evacuation. She said that a helicopter rescue, weather permitting, could take several days if conditions turned bad. Ranger Walsh's stern expression suggested that she had seen too many overconfident tourists become statistics. She asked what our combined wilderness experience was. I answered her honestly about my military background, while Michael mumbled vague references to camping with friends. The ranger's doubt was visible on her face. She told us with respect that the route was not appropriate for beginners, and that they had excellent guided tours and shorter trails. Michael interrupted her and told her we would be fine, saying that his father was practically a survival expert. After we signed liability waivers and watched safety videos about bear encounters, we rented bear-resistant food containers and emergency beacons. I insisted on renting a defensive rifle, a Remington 870 that felt familiar and comfortable in my hands. Michael nervously asked me if I was sure about renting it. I told him it was Alaska Rule Number 1. Never go unarmed in bear country. Our final stop was programming GPS coordinates into our emergency beacon. Ranger Walsh demonstrated the activation sequence for the beacon with professional precision. She said that all we had to do was push the button and hold it for 5 seconds, and that search and rescue would then get our exact location. She reminded us that in that remote back country, even with the coordinates, a rescue could take a minimum of 12 to 18 hours. As we loaded our packs into the truck, I felt that familiar pre-mission tension. Every detail was screaming a warning at me. The remote location, Michael's obvious inexperience, and his strange insistence on maximum isolation. As we drove away from the ranger station, I asked Michael if he was still certain about taking this route. He responded with a forced smile, saying there was no turning back now. His words struck me the wrong way. They felt less like encouragement and more like a declaration. I watched the ranger station disappear in the rearview mirror, our last connection to civilization fading into a wilderness that suddenly felt less like an adventure and more like a trap. The forest road narrowed, and tree branches scraped against our windows like skeletal fingers. My GPS showed our location as we moved deeper into unmarked territory, going past the last cell tower and beyond the final trail marker, into a wilderness that had swallowed other unprepared travelers before. I watched the signal bars vanish from my phone and murmured that we were officially off the grid now. Michael let out a hollow laugh and said that it was perfect, just us and nature. We reached mile 23, where the Tlonica River marked the end of the drivable road. I parked the truck next to some weathered wooden posts that looked like grave markers in the dim afternoon light. Unloading our packs revealed a significant difference in their weight. Mine was efficiently packed from decades of military training, while Michael's was bulging awkwardly with gear he had never used. He struggled with the shoulder straps and complained that his pack weighed a ton. I told him that proper packing takes practice and adjusted the weight for him, noticing that he winced when I touched his right shoulder. I asked him if he had hurt himself, and he told me it was just an old injury and nothing serious. The trail wound its way through a dense spruce forest where the afternoon sun barely managed to penetrate. Moss-covered logs created natural obstacles, and we had to carefully navigate small streams by stepping on stones. Signs of wildlife appeared immediately. There were massive moose tracks pressed into muddy patches, the cries of an eagle echoing from somewhere above the canopy, and a distant howling sound that told me there were wolves nearby. Michael suddenly stopped, his face pale, and asked if I could hear that. The wolf pack was probably 5 miles away. I kept walking, but I noticed his nervousness had nothing to do with appreciating wildlife. For someone who had insisted on this remote route, he seemed genuinely frightened by its realities. After 3 hours of hiking, we reached a clearing next to a creek, which was a perfect campsite with flat ground, fresh water, and clear sight lines in all directions. My military habits kicked in as I surveyed for defensive positions and escape routes, while Michael sat heavily on a fallen log. He asked me how much farther we had to go, breathing hard. I told him this was good for tonight, and we would push deeper into the wilderness tomorrow. Setting up our camp revealed more about Michael's inexperience. I methodically established our perimeter, hanging our food cache 12 feet high, setting up the cooking area downwind from our sleeping quarters, and making our emergency supplies easily accessible. Meanwhile, he struggled with basic tent assembly. He held up the tangled guidelines like surrender flags and asked me to help him. Teaching him the proper technique felt like the old days, back when he had actually wanted to learn something instead of just inheriting it. But something was bothering me. I wondered why he had insisted on wilderness camping when he couldn't handle the most basic equipment. The evening campfire cast dancing shadows across our small clearing. I prepared a simple meal while Michael sat uncharacteristically quiet, staring into the flames with an expression I couldn't read. The temperature was dropping steadily, and March nights in Alaska demanded respect. I tried to start a conversation, hoping to recapture some sort of connection, by asking him if he remembered when we used to do this. I reminded him that he was maybe 10 years old and had insisted on roasting marshmallows until they caught fire. He said with unexpected sadness that his mother was still alive then. He told me that she had loved our camping trips and that she always said they brought out the best in people. Michael nodded, but his eyes were still distant. He asked me to tell him about my childhood, before the military and before the business, and what it was like being poor. The question surprised me because Michael rarely showed any interest in my background. I found myself sharing stories I hadn't told in years. I talked about growing up in rural Montana, working on farms during the summer, and earning every dollar through sheer sweat and determination. He told me it sounded hard, but his tone suggested a cold calculation rather than sympathy. I told him that hard work builds character and that it taught me the value of earning what you have. A flicker of something, maybe resentment or frustration, crossed his features, but his voice remained carefully neutral when he spoke. He said it was lucky for him that he got to skip all that character building. Our conversation continued around the fire, with Michael prompting me for stories about my military service, my survival training, and the skills that had kept me alive in hostile environments. I shared more than I usually would have, encouraged by what seemed like genuine interest. He suddenly asked me how I could tell when someone was lying to me. I told him I looked for body language, voice patterns, and inconsistencies in their story. I poked the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness, and asked him why he wanted to know. He said he was just curious and that I had always been good at reading people. Later, as I banked the fire for the night, a peaceful silence settled over our campsite. Stars emerged in patterns I hadn't seen since my last deployment, completely unmarred by city lights. The wilderness felt pristine, untouched, almost sacred. Michael volunteered to take the first watch, saying he wasn't really tired yet. I asked him if he was sure, reminding him we had a long day tomorrow. He said he wanted to enjoy the moment and listen to the sounds of the forest. I crawled into my tent, trusting my son to wake me for the second shift. Through the nylon walls, I could hear him moving around the fire, adding logs and settling into a watch position. They were normal camping sounds that should have been comforting. But as I was about to fall asleep, something about his offer bothered me. In all of our conversations, Michael had never shown any interest in solitary reflection or appreciating nature. I wondered why he would start now. The last thing I noticed before exhaustion took over was the change in the sounds outside. There was no more casual movement around the fire, just a careful stillness that suggested someone was waiting for something rather than simply watching. The light of dawn filtering through my tent walls brought me back to consciousness. Outside, I heard the metallic clanking of equipment being loaded. It was too early and too urgent for normal morning preparations. I unzipped the tent flap and stepped into the frigid air, which made my breath visible in white puffs. Michael was standing by our truck, methodically packing our gear with a military efficiency I had never seen from him before. Every piece of our survival equipment, the GPS device, emergency beacon, rifle, and food containers, was disappearing into the vehicle. My voice cut through the morning silence as I asked what was going on. Michael was startled, then straightened up with a defiant posture. He told me he was getting ready to leave. I reminded him that we had planned for 3 more days and asked what the rush was, if there had been a change of plans. He avoided my eyes and continued to load the equipment, saying the weather was turning bad. The lie hung between us like smoke. The forecast from yesterday had been for clear skies, and there were no threatening clouds in sight. My military instincts, which had been dormant since arriving in Alaska, suddenly screamed warnings at me. I told him to talk to me and asked what was really happening here. Something snapped in his expression. Years of carefully controlled resentment exploded across his features like a dam bursting. He asked if I wanted to know what was happening, saying he was done with my control, my manipulation, and my constant judgment. I told him I didn't understand. He wheeled around, his fists clenched, and said not to call him son. He told me that sons don't get treated like employees and that they don't have to beg for every dollar while their father is sitting on millions. The venom in his voice hit me with a physical force. This wasn't just momentary anger. This was a hatred that had been festering for years beneath our family's surface. I said I had given him everything. He said I had given him nothing. His voice cracked with rage as he said I had made him dependent, kept him weak, and controlled every aspect of his life with my checkbook. He said he was taking control now. My hands were trembling as I finally understood everything. This entire camping trip had been planned. He laughed without warmth and told me I was finally catching on, calling me a military genius. I asked him why, saying that if he had needed money, we could have worked something out. He told me he didn't want my allowance anymore, that he wanted what was rightfully his. My businesses, my assets, everything I had been dangling over his head for decades. The cold morning air seemed to freeze around us. I stared at this stranger who was wearing my son's face and speaking words that shattered 20 years of my paternal love. I said he was planning to leave me there. He confirmed my words, saying he was leaving me there to figure things out for myself, and maybe 30 miles of wilderness would teach me what real dependence felt like. My chest constricted. I told him this was bear country and I had no equipment or GPS. He said I should have thought about that before I turned him into my puppet. He slammed the truck's tailgate shut. He said maybe I would survive and maybe I wouldn't, but either way he would inherit what should have been his years ago. I begged him to stop, the words scraping my throat raw. I told him that whatever I had done wrong, we could fix it, and I pleaded with him not to do this. For a moment, something flickered across his features. Maybe it was a hint of doubt or a memory of affection. Then his expression hardened into something unrecognizable as he said goodbye to me. He climbed into the driver's seat. He told me to try not to meet the Grizzlies too quickly because he wanted me to have time to think about what I had created. The engine roared to life. I stepped toward the truck, desperate to reason with him, but he put it in reverse and began backing away from me. Through the windshield, I could see his face, cold, calculated, and devoid of any filial emotion. My shout of "Michael!" echoed off the distant mountains as the truck disappeared around a bend. The sound of the engine gradually faded away, leaving me standing on an empty dirt road in the middle of the vast Alaskan wilderness, 30 miles from the nearest human being. Dust settled around my feet, and the silence that followed was absolute. There were no human sounds, no mechanical noises, just the whisper of the wind through the spruce trees and the distant cry of a hawk. I stood there for a long moment, trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. My son, the boy I had raised, protected, and provided for, had just sentenced me to death. The dust from Michael's truck was still hanging in the air when my military training kicked in, overriding the emotional devastation I felt. I realized that shock was a luxury I couldn't afford, not 30 miles from civilization and deep in grizzly country. I forced myself to breathe steadily, allowing decades of Navy discipline to take control. The first rule of survival is to assess your resources. I patted down my pockets. I found my wallet, house keys, and a small folding knife I had forgotten about. I had no food, no water, no GPS, no emergency beacon, the clothes on my back, and nothing else. The second rule is to evaluate your environment. It was March in Alaska, which meant the temperatures would drop below freezing at night. The terrain around me consisted of a dense spruce forest, unmarked trails, and complete isolation. Ranger Walsh's warnings echoed in my memory: recent grizzly activity, wolf packs, and unpredictable weather patterns. The third rule is to prioritize your survival needs in this order: shelter, water, signaling, and navigation. I studied the position of the sun to calculate my direction. I knew that going east would lead me deeper into the wilderness, while going west would eventually lead to the main park road, though I couldn't determine at what distance. My aging memory summoned fragments of topographical knowledge from the ranger station briefing. I remembered that the river systems generally flowed northwest toward the park boundary. I knew that movement was critical and that standing still would mean my death. I began walking west, following the faint tire tracks that Michael had left behind. Within 100 yards, the tire tracks diverged from what appeared to be an animal trail cutting through the underbrush. I knew that game trails usually lead to water sources, which are essential for survival and for potential rescue visibility. Every step required a conscious effort. At 58 years old, my knees protested the uneven terrain, and my civilian conditioning was nowhere near my military peak. But anger was fueling my movement. Fury at Michael's betrayal, at my own blindness, and at the years I had wasted enabling his transformation into this monster. The forest closed around me like a living tunnel. The massive spruce trees blocked most of the sunlight, creating a twilight atmosphere even at midday. I broke branches as I walked, creating crude trail markers for potential rescue teams, even though the odds of anyone finding me seemed impossibly remote. I began to see bear signs everywhere: claw marks on tree bark, massive paw prints in the soft earth, and scat that looked disturbingly fresh. I made noise as I walked, remembering Ranger Walsh's instructions about avoiding surprise encounters. The irony wasn't lost on me. My son had put me in a situation where bears might be the least of my problems. Hours passed, and my mouth grew dry, then parched. The game trail meandered through increasingly dense vegetation, and several times I lost it completely, forcing me to backtrack and search for its continuation. Exhaustion was creeping into my legs, but stopping would mean losing precious daylight. A distant sound made me freeze. It was a mechanical, rhythmic sound, definitely human-made: engines, multiple engines. I stood perfectly still, listening. The sound was coming from the north, maybe half a mile away, and it sounded like ATVs or motorcycles. Hunters, park rangers, or search and rescue. Hope surged through my chest for the first time since Michael's betrayal. I changed direction, moving toward the mechanical sounds and pushing through the undergrowth that was tearing at my clothing. The sounds grew louder, and they were definitely all-terrain vehicles. They seemed to be moving slowly and methodically. The forest began to thin, and through the trees, I caught a glimpse of a clearing up ahead. The sounds of the engines were closer now, maybe 200 yards away. I moved faster, abandoning stealth for speed, with branches whipping across my face as I pushed toward a potential salvation. I broke through the tree-line and stumbled into a clearing where 4 ATV riders had stopped for what appeared to be a lunch break. They looked up in shock as I emerged from the forest, disheveled and scratched, clearly out of place in this remote wilderness. The lead rider, a bearded man in his 40s with the weathered look of someone who lives outdoors, immediately shut off his engine and approached me with professional concern. He asked me what had happened and why I was out there all alone. My voice came out hoarse from dehydration and stress. I told him my son had left me there, taken all of our equipment, and drove away. The man's expression shifted from concern to disbelief. He said someone abandoned me out there and that it was attempted murder. I told him my name was William and that my son Michael had brought me on a camping trip. I struggled to explain the situation without revealing the full extent of my family's dysfunction. I told him that he had taken our truck and all of our survival gear and had said he was leaving me there to die. He simply said, "Jesus." The bearded man removed his helmet, revealing intelligent eyes that seemed to be assessing my condition and my story at the same time. He told me his name was Oliver Reed and that he was a former park ranger. He said that these were his friends and they were doing a backcountry tour. The other riders gathered around me, their faces showing the horror that outdoor enthusiasts feel when they encounter deliberate wilderness abandonment. One of them, a woman in her 30s, handed me a water bottle that I drained gratefully. Oliver asked me how long ago it had happened, his tone becoming professional and urgent. I told him it had happened that morning, maybe 4 hours ago. Oliver exchanged glances with his companions, saying that we needed to get out of there immediately. He said that the radio range was limited, but we could reach the ranger station from a higher elevation. He continued to study his GPS device and said there was something else. He said that if my son had taken the main road out, he would be looking at a minimum 6-hour drive to reach Anchorage. He said he knew an old ranger trail that cut through the backcountry, and we could have me back to the park entrance in 90 minutes. The implication hit me like electricity. I asked if he meant I could get back before him. Oliver said, "Easily." He then asked if I wanted to involve law enforcement immediately or if I had other plans. Something hard crystallized in my chest, replacing the desperation and fear I had carried since dawn. Michael had calculated my death, planned my abandonment, and counted on my helplessness. He had made one critical error, underestimating the wilderness community's solidarity and my own survival instincts. I carefully told him I wanted to get back to the motel first before I decided anything about the police. Oliver nodded in understanding, and he passed a helmet between us. He told me to climb on behind him, saying we would take the ranger trail and that my son would never see us coming. The ATV ride through the hidden forest paths revealed a side of Denali I had never imagined. A network of service trails maintained for emergency access, known only to rangers and serious backcountry guides. Oliver navigated with the confidence of someone who had traveled these routes for years. He explained over the engine noise that he had spent 15 years as a ranger there, and that he had seen a lot of stupid decisions, but that deliberate abandonment was in criminal territory. The terrain blurred past us. Creek crossings, steep inclines, and sections where we had to dismount and guide the ATVs around fallen trees. Despite the rough conditions, we made excellent time, emerging onto a paved road well ahead of Oliver's estimate. The Denali Lodge Motel appeared in the distance, and its log cabin architecture looked incredibly welcoming after my morning in the wilderness. As we approached the parking area, I scanned for our rental truck, which had not yet returned. Oliver observed that my son was still driving back and that I had time to prepare whatever reception I was planning. The other riders offered their contact information, promising to serve as witnesses if legal proceedings became necessary. Oliver handed me his card, which was inscribed with his personal cell and email. He told me to call him when I was ready to talk to the authorities and that what my son did needed to have consequences. As they were preparing to leave, Oliver paused and asked me what I was planning to do when he got back. I looked toward the motel room where our belongings were waiting, and then at the legal documents still folded in my jacket pocket. Michael had spent years planning my destruction. Now it was my turn to plan his. I quietly told him I was going to give him exactly what he wanted, just not the way he expected to get it. Back in our motel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out my phone. Oliver's card lay beside me, along with his offer to contact the authorities immediately. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. The legal documents I had prepared back in Seattle felt prophetic now, folded in my jacket pocket like a loaded weapon. 3 weeks ago, I had changed my will in a moment of paternal disappointment. Now, that decision looked like divine preparation for war. I spread the papers across the small desk, reviewing the language I had crafted with my attorney. Michael would inherit nothing. Everything would go to wildlife conservation charities, veterans organizations, and a scholarship fund in Sarah's name. The irony was perfect. My son's attempt to murder me for an inheritance would leave him with exactly nothing. But legal documents alone were not enough. I needed evidence, witnesses, and consequences that would follow Michael for the rest of his life. I dialed Oliver's number, and he answered on the first ring. I told him I was settled in and that I needed his help with something specific. I said that when Michael returned, I wanted everything documented, his reaction, his words, and everything he said. Oliver asked if I was planning to confront him before calling the police. I told him I was planning to give him exactly what he thought he wanted. The chance to inherit my business, right up until the moment he realized what he had actually done to himself. Silence stretched across the connection. Finally, Oliver spoke. "That's strategic. You want me there as a witness?" I said, "If you're willing, and maybe bring that digital camera you had on the trail. Michael is going to say things that should be preserved for a jury." He asked me what time I was expecting him. I calculated Michael's route, the main park road to Anchorage Highway, with probable stops for gas and food, and his tendency to drive cautiously on unfamiliar roads. I told him that he would probably arrive between 9 and 10 tonight, tired and overconfident, and expecting to find an empty room and a grieving father who had never made it back. Instead, he would find his intended victim very much alive and very well prepared. After Oliver agreed to arrive by 8:30, I called my attorney in Seattle. The conversation was brief but crucial. Tomorrow morning, the new will would be filed officially, regardless of tonight's outcome. Michael's inheritance would evaporate the moment the legal documents hit the courthouse. Next, I contacted the motel office and arranged for an adjacent room for Oliver. The desk clerk, an elderly woman who had seen decades of Alaskan drama, asked no questions about the unusual request. Evening approached with a surreal calm. I showered off the wilderness grime, changed into clean clothes, and methodically arranged the room. The legal documents were spread across the desk where Michael would see them immediately. Oliver's camera would have clear sight lines from the adjoining room. My phone was programmed with 911 on speed dial. My military training had taught me that preparation eliminated variables. Tonight, Michael would walk into a controlled environment where every advantage belonged to me. The irony wasn't lost on me. My son had spent months planning my death in the wilderness. Now I was planning his social and financial death in civilization. The difference was that my plan would leave him alive to face the consequences. At 8:15, Oliver knocked softly. He entered carrying professional photography equipment and the grim expression of someone who had seen too many wilderness tragedies. He said he had recording equipment set up in the adjacent room with audio and video coverage of the entire space. He gestured toward the connecting door and said that when he arrived, I would have everything documented. He told me that legally what he did was attempted murder in the first degree, and that Alaska took wilderness abandonment seriously. He said that with my testimony, his witness statement, and whatever Michael said tonight, he was looking at serious prison time. I nodded, feeling a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Then we waited. Outside, darkness gathered around the motel like a closing fist. Through the window, I could see the main road, where Michael's headlights would soon appear, carrying him toward a reckoning he had never imagined was possible. My phone showed 8:47 p.m. Any minute now, my son would discover that his perfect crime had become his perfect downfall. Headlights swept across the parking lot, and I recognized the distinctive sound of our rental truck engine. Michael had returned from his failed murder attempt, probably rehearsing a grief-stricken phone call to report his father's tragic disappearance. I positioned myself in the chair facing the door, with the legal documents clearly visible on the desk. Through the connecting wall, I heard Oliver adjusting his recording equipment. Everything was ready. Michael's key scraped the lock twice before catching. When the door opened, he stepped inside with the cautious air of someone expecting to find an empty room. The overhead light illuminated his face, and I watched as recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Dad." The word came out strangled and disbelieving. I simply said, "Hello, son. How was your drive?" His face cycled through confusion, shock, and something approaching terror. He asked me how I was there and how I got back. I told him it turned out I was harder to kill than he had calculated. Michael's legs seemed to buckle slightly. He gripped the door frame, his eyes darting around the room as if he were searching for an escape route. He said he didn't understand, and that he had left me 30 miles from nowhere without food, water, or equipment. "Yes, I remember," I said, keeping my voice conversational, almost friendly. Interesting choice of last words, by the way. Go meet the Grizzlies. It really captured the sentiment beautifully. "Dad, wait. You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said. "You brought me to Alaska to murder me for my inheritance. You spent months planning it, researched the most remote location possible, and even practiced your shocked son routine for when the authorities found my body." Michael's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "The problem with your plan," I continued, standing slowly, "is that you underestimated the wilderness community. It turns out there are people who actually help each other survive instead of abandoning family members to die." I told him that this was about money for him, that it always had been, and that I finally understood that. I told him that every conversation, every camping trip, and every moment of what I had thought was father-son bonding was just him calculating my net worth. I walked to the desk and picked up the legal documents. "You want to know what's fascinating? 3 weeks ago, right after our fight, I changed my will. I called it paternal disappointment at the time." Michael's eyes locked onto the papers in my hands. "What do you mean, changed?" "I mean you inherit nothing," I said. "Not the auto shops, not the bank accounts, not the house your mother loved. Everything goes to charity, wildlife conservation, veterans organizations, and scholarship funds." The color drained from his face completely. "You can't do that. I'm your son. You were my son. This morning you became something else entirely. A man who calculated his father's death for financial gain." "Dad, please, if you'll just listen." "I listened this morning while you explained how my controlling behavior ruined your life. I listened when you said I deserved to die alone in bear country. I'm done listening." Michael's composure cracked completely. "You self-righteous bastard. You created this. Your constant control, your manipulation, keeping me dependent while judging every choice I made. There it is. The real Michael Harper. You want to destroy me? Fine. But remember, you made me into this. Every dollar you dangled, every condition you attached, every way you controlled my life. This is your creation." I felt a strange calm settle over me. "You're absolutely right. I did create this. I enabled your dependence, bought your affection, and confused providing with parenting. That's my failure as a father. Then change the will back. Fix this. The will was filed this afternoon. It's done." I walked toward the door, past my son, who looked smaller, somehow diminished. "But you're wrong about one thing. I didn't create your willingness to commit murder. That choice was entirely yours." Michael's voice cracked as he asked where I was going. "To call the police. Attempted murder is still a felony, even when it fails. Dad, wait! I paused at the threshold. Goodbye, Michael. In a strange way, you've given me exactly what I needed. Absolute clarity about who you really are. The last thing I saw before stepping outside was my son collapsing into the chair I had vacated, staring at the legal documents that represented the complete destruction of everything he had tried to gain through my death. The fluorescent lights in the Anchorage Police Department interview room buzzed overhead as Detective Sarah Martinez reviewed the evidence spread across the metal table. Oliver's digital recordings, my sworn statement, and Michael's own recorded confession from the motel room created an overwhelming case. "Mr. Harper," she said, "I've been investigating wilderness crimes for 8 years. This is the most premeditated case of attempted murder I've encountered." Detective Martinez clicked through the audio recordings on her laptop. "Your son's statements are remarkably incriminating." "He always was thorough when he wanted something," I said. "The district attorney will file charges this morning. Attempted murder in the first degree, reckless endangerment, and conspiracy to commit fraud regarding your inheritance. Alaska doesn't treat wilderness abandonment lightly. It's essentially a death sentence with extra steps." Through the interview room window, I could see Michael in handcuffs being processed at the booking desk. An overnight in jail had stripped away his last pretenses. There was no more manipulation and no more charm, just a 28-year-old man facing the consequences of calculated evil. Oliver sat beside me, having driven down from Denali to provide his witness testimony. I asked him what the likely sentence for this kind of crime was. 15 to 25 years, depending on plea negotiations. Alaska views deliberate wilderness abandonment as equivalent to attempted murder, because that's exactly what it is. I watched my son through the glass, feeling an unexpected absence of satisfaction. This wasn't a victory. It was just the natural endpoint of choices he had made over years of increasing entitlement and resentment. "Will you be returning to Seattle today?" Detective Martinez asked. "Tomorrow. I need to visit my attorney here first and finalize some estate planning documents." The detective nodded knowingly. "Making sure your new will is completely secure, among other things." I stood, gathering my jacket and the evidence folders. "I'm establishing a foundation in my late wife's name. It seems appropriate that Michael's inheritance should help people who actually deserve assistance." Oliver and I walked out of the police station into the crisp Anchorage morning air. Downtown traffic moved with the typical Alaska pace, unhurried, practical, and purposeful. "What happens now?" Oliver asked. "Back to your business in Seattle." I looked up at the Chugach Mountains rising beyond the city skyline. "Back to figuring out what kind of man I want to be in whatever years I have left." It turns out surviving your own child's murder attempt gives you remarkable clarity about priorities. He asked if I was planning to visit him during the trial. The question caught me off guard. I considered it seriously, the paternal instinct to maintain a connection warring against the reality of what Michael had attempted. "No," I said. "The man I raised died somewhere in those woods yesterday morning. What's left isn't my son anymore." We reached Oliver's truck in the parking lot. He handed me a business card with his personal information. "If you ever want to come back to Alaska for the right reasons, camping, fishing, actually enjoying the wilderness, call me. The first trip's on the house." "Why would you do that?" I asked. "Because you survived something that should have killed you, and instead of letting it make you bitter, you're using it to help other people. That's worth supporting." I shook his hand, feeling genuine gratitude for this stranger who had become an unlikely ally. "Thank you for everything. Thank the wilderness community. We look out for each other up here." As Oliver drove away, I pulled out my phone and dialed my attorney in Seattle. There were foundations to establish, scholarships to fund, and a lifetime of enabling to undo through positive action. Michael had brought me to Alaska to die for money. Instead, I had learned to live for purpose. In trying to destroy me, he had accidentally taught me the difference between providing for someone and actually caring about them. The irony was perfect and perfectly just. 3 days later, back in Seattle, I received a letter from Michael in jail. It was 5 pages of manipulation disguised as an apology. promising change if I would just reconsider the inheritance and explaining how prison would ruin his life. I read it once, then fed it through my office shredder. Some relationships don't survive attempted murder, no matter how much money you have invested in them.